my friend, and welcome to the study. Today, we're going on a trip to the opera. But not just any opera. It is 1882, and we are in the age of invention, the age of Alexander Graham Bell, Sir Joseph Swan, Thomas Edison, the Lumiere brothers and their cinematograph. And already in April 1881, what is likely the first human-carrying electric vehicle with its own power source was tested in Paris by the French inventor Gustave Drouet. This was accomplished by improving the efficiency of a small electric motor developed by Siemens, the German company, and using the recently developed rechargeable battery, and fitting it then to an English James Starley tricycle, creating the world's first electric vehicle and beginning a flurry of electric car development and production. In this same year, London's Savoy Theatre became the first public building in the world to be lit entirely by electricity. Sir Joseph Swan, the inventor, supplied over 1,200 incandescent lamps powered by an 89-kilowatt generator that stood outside on open land near the theatre. This new illumination inspired the set engineers too, and by the 1882 Christmas show, a production of Gilbert and Sullivan's opera Iolanthe, miniature lighting had been incorporated into the rich set design, and even the costumes in this opera spanning the fantastical and modern worlds. Iolanthe, or The Peer and the Peri, a comic opera, opened at the Savoy on the 25th of November 1882, the 7th of 14 operatic collaborations by the immensely popular duo composer Arthur Sullivan and librettist W.S. Gilbert, and their first to premiere at the Savoy. As all of their witty collaborations, Iolanthe satirizes British society with an at first oblique focus on government and law, moving with greater acerbity as the brilliantly composed arias, costuming, sets, and sharply witty libretto come together to hold a mirror up to the world and the people in it. It is this keenness of clever humour and talent for making a satire not only a thoroughly jolly and enjoyable affair, but the element of introspection that make Gilbert and Sullivan operas timeless. On opening night, a copy of the libretto was distributed to the audience, and, as it was not possible to dim the electric lights to the extent it is now, there was sufficient light to read them easily. Everyone was so fascinated that they scarcely looked at the stage, but when the time came for a page turn, one critic notes that there was the rustling as of the leaves in a forest. The audience followed the book as if it was inspired oracles of Delphi, and there were such roars of laughter. The electric starlights, which the principal fairies wore on top of their heads, aroused such excitement. They had been made by the Swan United Electric Light Company, and were powered by a small battery carried on the fairies' shoulders and hidden by their long flowing hair. It was the first theatre production in the world to be illuminated entirely with electric lights, benefiting from the effects that would not have been possible with gas lighting. Proprietor Richard Dolicart, stepped on stage and broke a glowing light bulb before the audience to demonstrate the safety of this new technology. The mesmerized audience gazed with excitement as the curtain was raised on the first stage performance to be lit by electricity. I have these cigarette cards. Not from smoking, mind you, but the kind that used to come in the cigarette tobacco packs 100 years ago and more. And these particular ones are from the Players cigarettes. They have the characters from Gilbert and Sullivan's Iolanthe. And we can use them to go through the synopsis of this jolly opera. It begins with a fairy, Iolanthe, who, after marrying a mortal man, an act forbidden by fairy law, is living in exile in a river with frogs. Almost reminds you of Aristophanes. Her death sentence having been commuted by the generous fairy queen on the condition that she never see her husband again. Iolanthe is greatly missed as the beloved organizer of the fairy dances, and I could only find one fairy cigarette card. I've made another here, but I'm not sure which fairy that is. So we have Celia, and we'll call this one Layla, and then Fleta, which I don't have, so we'll imagine there's another fairy there. Those are the principal fairies, and of course there are more, of fairies. After 25 years, the fairies plead for her pardon in return, and Iolanthe is welcomed back by the fairies, but she brings with her a son, Strephon, who from the waist up is a fairy, but he has the legs of his mortal father. Strephon is the image of an Arcadian shepherd. Arcadia being a mythical, pastoral setting in which all good things happen of peace and harmony, very neoclassical, perfect for a satire by Gilbert and Sullivan. He is in love with Phyllis, the mortal, and the ward of the Lord Chancellor. Who has forbidden them to marry, being in love with her himself. In fact, most of the peers are in love with Phyllis, who openly rejects proposals from them, favoring the pastoral life she can have with Strephon, her beloved shepherd. So here we have the Lord Chancellor and Earl Tollalo and the Earl of Mount Ararat. So more fun with names with Gilbert and Sullivan. And that gives us all of our major players. And, of course, Private Willis, the Parliamentarian Guard. Playing at this opening night are Mr. George Grossmith as Lord Chancellor, Rutland Harrington as Earl Mount Ararat, Earl Tollalo played by Mr. Durward Lely, Private Willis, Mr. Charles Manners, Strephon, Mr. Temple, Queen of the Fairies, played by Miss Alice Barnett, and Iolanthe, Miss Jessie Dont. The fairies, Layla, Celia, and Fleta, played by Maud Cathcart, Miss Fortescue and Miss Sybil Grey, and, last but not least, Phyllis, an Arcadian shepherdess and ward of the Lord Chancellor, played by Leonora Brown. Strephon appeals to Iolanthe to help him win Phyllis's hand from her guardian, the Lord Chancellor. But they are spied together by the peers and by Phyllis, who all assume that Iolanthe is Strephon's lover, fairies having a youthful countenance, being immortal as they are. The peers then mistake the fairies for a group of schoolgirls, offending the fairy queen, who then sentences them by magic to be led in Parliament by Strephon, who will have power over both houses of Parliament. This, of course, sets off a series of dramatic situations that ends with a climactic confrontation between the peers and the fairies. All ends well, however, when the Lord Chancellor suggests a solution by changing the fairy law simply by the insertion of a single word. Every fairy shall die who does not marry a mortal. The fairy queen cheerfully agrees, and the fairies all select mortal husbands. The coup de grace comes when, seeing no reason to remain in the mortal realm if peers are to be recruited from persons of actual intelligence, the peers join the fairies and fly off to fairyland. Critics were as enthusiastic as the audience that first night. On the opening night, C.J. Phipps, the theatre designer, took curtain calls along with Gilbert, Sullivan, and Dolicat. The opera was replete with a spectrum of tone, one critic writing of the intermingling of whimsy, fantasy, romance, wit, and political satire. Though Vanity Fair found the music to be decidedly superior to the libretto, it was the beginning of the pinnacle of Sir Arthur Sullivan's operatic compositions, and an apex of innovative absurdist style for Gilbert. In the late 19th century world of fantasy that had developed, spurred to degrees by the Biedermeier of post-Napoleonic Europe, the rediscovery of medieval fantastical material, the neo-Gothic and arts and crafts movements, a world of fantastical fairy tales like those of Perrault and Planchet, no, not D'Artagnan's valet, and wistful art and poetry, but also of industrial and imperial expansion on a grand scale. This operetta came in the wake of the London premiere of Richard Wagner's Ring Cycle earlier that year, with its mythological creatures, intricate libretto, and full orchestration. Wagner's idea of leitmotif, a grouping of notes to signify a certain character, is taken up in that Iolanthe is accompanied by a distinctive four-note theme, while the music of the Fairy Queen is almost a parody of that for Wagner's tragic heroine Brünnhilde. Certainly Sullivan was familiar, too, with the 1842 production of Shakespeare's Midsummer Night's Dream, that had been accompanied by Felix Mendelssohn's fairy music. Sullivan's personal attention to this new operetta, as opposed to his previous ones which were assembled by his assistants, produced music that was acclaimed as a great advance in style, taking the idea of metamorphosis of themes to new levels of subtlety and fluidity, with innovations in emotional range and use of layering parts and themes, contrasting its sentimental tenderness to the absurdly comical lyrics of Gilbert. Gilbert, too, was not without influences of the 19th century fairy craze. He was familiar enough with works to parody, borrow from, and elaborate upon, including The Mountain Sylph by John Barnett, and his own Happy Arcadia, a romanticization of an ancient Greek setting favoured in the neoclassical era, as well as fairy comedies he had written for the Haymarket Theatre in the 1870s. Gilbert liked to develop the idea of self-revelation deriving from the interference of some magic or supernatural force. There is the age-old battle between the sexes, and between order and chaos, that is personified in Iolanthe's characters and plot, with the inevitable love of a mortal bringing down the house of cards. As the best satire, the glaring normalcy of reality is made to look ridiculous when contrasted with what would be nonsensical, but is in actuality practical and sensible. Gilbert satirically sets up the fantastical fairies as the agents of sound practicality. The peers in their sober robes and pomp are rendered absurd by the portrayal of the fairies who, whilst fantastical creatures, seem more pragmatic and more sympathetic, and Strephon the romantic finally leads both houses of Parliament. Iolanthe ran for 398 performances at the Savoy until the 1st of January 1884. The Dolly Cart Opera Company, which had begun in 1875 by the impresario Richard Dolly Cart, who first asked Gilbert and Sullivan to collaborate, toured the opera nearly continuously in repertory form from 1891 until 1982, and made several recordings of the opera over that period. Numerous other professional and amateur productions have been given for this enduring work, and various other recordings have been issued. The company produced 10 Gilbert and Sullivan operas, as well as many others, including companion pieces, mostly at the Savoy Theatre, which Carte built in 1881 specifically for that purpose. The Savoy Theatre finds itself in London's West End, in the Strand, in the city of Westminster. The Savoy opened on 10th of October 1881 and was built on the site of the old Savoy Palace that had belonged to the maternal uncle of Eleanor of Aquitaine, Queen Consort of Henry III. Built purposely to house the Gilbert and Sullivan works, the Savoy later accommodated those by other composer-librettist teams, which had formative influence on the creation of the modern musical. This new state-of-the-art theatre carried a perfect view of the stage from every seat in the house. There were exits on all 4 sides of the theatre and fireproof materials to ensure maximum safety to the public. There were 3 tiers with 4 levels: stalls and pit, balcony, circle, and amphitheatre, as well as gallery at the top, with an overall seating capacity of 1,292. Satire and comedy, music and frivolity were not the only wizard inventions to flourish at the Savoy. Technology, too, showed off its applications in that 1882 premiere of Iolanthe, illuminating the fairy world on stage as easily as the audience's programs for reading. That is why, to this day, we use the term fairy lights. To complete our evening at the opera, it seems appropriate to introduce a spirit here. One often termed the green fairy, Absinthe. It is a liqueur or spirit, very strong, but it has its roots in medicinal, herbal distillation from the Middle Ages, like several other herb-based spirits, including Kümmel, which we've had here in the study before. It is green in color and has a very anise or licorice flavor, as well as herbs, and is actually quite lovely, even though it's very strong. Let's see what our man Stuart Walton says about absinthe. The most famous pastis of them all is absinthe. Pastis being one of the most important traditional drinks of Europe. The principal flavoring being either licorice or aniseed and other herbal ingredients, which has been known as digestive medicine since the time of the Egyptians and still in use today. Absinthe, the only category of alcohol apart from home distillates ever to have been made illegal. In fact, absinthe was banned until the 1990s because it got a bad reputation. Since the 1990s, however, it has happily been restored to us. What originally doomed it was that it contained wormwood in concentrations held responsible for corroding the brain. During the late 19th century, it was the house drink of decadent Parisian artists and others, many of whom died the kinds of squalid deaths associated with laudanum use during the English Romantic period. So its association with the opium deaths and general bohemian lifestyle did it some discredit. Also, absinthe is being made in France again. It is still officially persona non grata there, and much is made in Eastern Europe, especially the Czech Republic. Now, this book is about 20 years old, so I think the production has expanded somewhat since then. When absinthe was given its marching orders in France by a governmental decree of 1915, other countries followed suit. One of its chief manufacturers, the firm of Henri Louis Pernod, which had been making it for over a century, then turned to making a similar product without wormwood at a lower alcoholic strength. So the alcoholic strength for absinthe is at least 55, and more usually 65 to 70. And Walton mentions a Bulgarian product bottled at just a heartbeat under 90%. How to drink absinthe? You can mix it with water, or putting it in a glass. Use a specially designed spoon that balances over the edge of the glass, on which you put a sugar cube. Over this cube is poured ice water, and there you have the drink of absinthe, watered and sweetened, although, in my opinion, it doesn't need much sweetening. It's such a delightful, refreshing spirit. If you've dissolved the sugar cube with ice water, you can add a splash of Angostura bitters, and you have an absinthe cocktail. One of my favorite ways to drink absinthe is in the cocktail called the Monkey Gland, which is a gin-based cocktail, very fruity, and with a spot of licorice of the absinthe, very refreshing. And I'll put the recipe below in the description. Or if you are a fan of black books, you can have it with bees. I hope you've enjoyed our evening at the opera and the story of fairy lights. And that, as always, this brings you calm and peace as you float off to a very restful sleep or a productive day with serenity in your intellect kindness in your spirit. Be good to yourself. Be kind to others. And be extremely